Welcome to the Bay Area Book Festival. Today we will be discussing David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth, a very troubling work of what I would describe as science nonfiction. I highly recommend it, and I believe he will be signing books after today's program, so you can go find him. Some quick housekeeping, just a reminder to be decent audience members and silence your cell phones. We would also like to thank our sponsors, our generous sponsors, for this discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to begin the program. So if everyone's got their phones off, we will be getting started. So I've found that if nothing else, the impending ecological apocalypse can make for interesting conversation. And I think that I've listened to a number of David's interviews, and I think that he might agree with that. Yes? Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, let's see. Okay. So today I'll be speaking with David Wallace Wells. He's the author of the best-selling The Uninhabitable Earth. He's a New America Fellow, as well as a columnist and deputy editor for New York Magazine. My name is Julian Brave Noisecat. I lead the Green New Deal work for Data for Progress, a think tank, and was until very recently the US policy lead for 350.org, global grassroots climate campaign. I'm also a journalist and a proud member of the Cannon Lake Band Tic Eschen, and I also went to high school just down the street at Berkeley High. And I believe at least one of my classmates is in the audience today. I couldn't find, oh, there he is, yeah. My friend Nick, we graduated the same class and played lacrosse together. So I'm gonna try not to be too nervous throughout this interview. Luckily, I'm the one asking the questions, not answering them, but if I'm sweating a little bit, that's the reason. Okay, so I wanted to begin just with a quick sort of anecdote from some of my own recent reporting. A number of you may have heard about the flooding in the Midwest that is still impacting communities in Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. And amidst that flooding 2 months ago, I was sent on assignment with HuffPost and Harper's to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is in South Dakota, right on the border with Nebraska, and is one of the poorest places in the United States. It regularly sort of tops the list of poorest counties in the United States. And while I was there on the ground, I traveled to Wounded Knee, the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre, where in 1890, hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children were gunned down by the United States military. And when I was there, standing and paying my respects at that mass grave, at the same time, the residents of the Wounded Knee houses, which are homes built by Housing and Urban Development near Wounded Knee Creek, were evacuating their homes and walking to the US Post Office to go get rations. So at my feet, I was standing at the site of a mass grave, the site of a prior apocalypse that happened here in these United States, and at the base of the hill where I was standing, the sort of next apocalypse, the ecological apocalypse that we're all sort of facing down, was unfolding right before me. And I think that it's important to remember, as we talk about big, terrifying issues like climate change, that this is not for many people, and for, I'd say, brown people, indigenous people in particular, this is not the first apocalypse that our communities have faced. This is not the first existential threat that humanity has lived through. And so I wanted to begin with that as we sort of move into a discussion of contemporary issues and the sort of future that we are all facing down, which is a very troubling future indeed. At present, we find ourselves amidst a sort of climate moment, as my sort of colleague and mentor, Bill McKibben, has described it to me. There are today 50 million more Americans who, according to survey data, consider themselves alarmed about climate change than there were just 6 years ago in 2013. This fall, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggested that we need to get our acts together in the next decade, or we are going to be facing even more troubling waters ahead. And that report was actually corroborated by the findings of the so-called Black Friday report, a report released by the Trump administration on Black Friday after Thanksgiving that also suggested that our own country, despite our wealth, is in for quite the ride if we don't get our acts together very soon. At the same time, there is a global youth climate movement that is rising on this side of the Atlantic and the other side of the Atlantic. On this side, it is being led by a number of my friends and colleagues in a group called the Sunrise Movement, a group that's fighting for a Green New Deal to take on the challenge of climate change. On the other side of the Atlantic, we of course have Greta Thunberg and the climate strikes, which are actually having an impact here as well. And I think this climate moment is also showing up in the literature. So my colleague Bill McKibben, who I just mentioned, has a new book called Falter, which is sort of a sequel to his first book, The End of Nature, which was the first book on climate change for a sort of general audience. We also have Nathaniel Rich's book, Losing Earth, which was based on his blockbuster New York Times Magazine piece that was also sort of widely criticized in the climate community. And of course, we also have David's book, The Uninhabitable Earth. So, in this climate moment, we are also getting a lot of troubling, but also I would say very good reading material. So at the very least, we have good stuff to read. Keep us up at night. So to begin, David, I wanted to ask if you could just give a quick summary of what the core sort of argument and thrust is of your book.
Sure, but before I do that, I want to just thank you for talking to me. I'm, great to be in conversation with someone who I admire so much, and thank you all for coming out even so early on a Sunday morning to hear about how bad things are out there. I sort of, I think the best way for me to summarize succinctly the argument of the book was to say climate change is happening a lot faster than we thought. It's happening in many more places than we thought, and it's almost certain to be considerably worse than we thought. And to take each of those in turn, I at least, I was raised, I'm a child of the 90s, I was raised in that era and understood climate change to be a real problem, a real threat. But I also understood that it was really something that was going to be unfolding on the timescale of decades and maybe centuries. So that, Jim Hansen, who's one of the most publicly alarmed climate scientists, his major public general work for a general audience book is called Storms of My Grandchildren. And I think that timeline was conventionally understood as the one that we were dealing with here. But in fact, half of all of the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels in the entire history of humanity have come in just the last 30 years. And that's especially concerning when you realize that that's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established its IPCC body, which means that we've done that damage knowingly. We've done more damage knowingly than we ever managed in ignorance, which is concerning to anyone who thinks that simply coming to terms with the scale of the problem is sufficient to solving it. Because truthfully, we've known for quite a long time now how important this issue was, and we've done very little up until this point to address it. The second issue is about this kind of the scope of the problem. I'm speaking again as someone who I haven't spent my whole life in the environmental movement, but of course, as an engaged person thinking about the future, I was aware of what it was, what we were collectively worrying over, what the climate threats were said to be, read about those threats in our newspapers, and I watched stories about them on our television programs, and I felt I had a very clear sense of what the problem was with Arctic melt and therefore sea level rise. I had heard a lot about that. But I felt that because that so dominated the story we were told about climate change, it meant that you could feel, if you lived anywhere but the coast, as though you were generally speaking safe. It meant that you could think of climate change as a threat that could be compartmentalized or localized. And the more that I learned about the sort of deep research, especially the new research on climate change, the more I learned about the economic impacts, which promise a global GDP as much as 30% smaller than it would be without climate change by the end of the century. That's an impact that's twice as big as the Great Depression. To agricultural yields, which could be half as bountiful as they are today, and we'd be using them probably to feed 50% more people. To conflict, because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. If we stay on the course we're on, we could have twice as much war as we have today or more. I just started to see this as a much more all-encompassing, inescapable story. There's nowhere on the earth that you can avoid the impacts of climate change, certainly going forward. And, it's important to note that this is a universal story. It also punishes us unequally, so that it's already hitting many people in the global south much more intensely than those of us living places like the United States feel it. And that disparity will continue to play out in the decades and the century ahead, so that even though we will be dealing in the United States with some quite intense impacts, it's also the case that elsewhere in the world people will be hit much, much, much harder. So that's the sort of scope problem. And then there's the severity problem, which is that, we heard a lot about this level of warming, 2 degrees, which scientists of the world called the threshold of catastrophe, and island nations of the world called genocide, that we could be forgiven for thinking that that was about a worst case scenario. Everybody was always talking about what we have to do to avoid 2 degrees. Can we possibly avoid 2 degrees? In fact, the IPCC report that Julian mentioned a few minutes ago was explicitly focused on that question. How can we safely avoid 2 degrees of warming? I think that meant, that led us to think that that was about a worst case scenario. And in fact, it's about a best case scenario. I think it will require, the UN says it will require a global mobilization at the scale of World War II to avoid it. And the Secretary General says we need to begin that mobilization this year, 2019. I think anyone in this room can say we're not about to do that. We're making enormous progress. We are in a climate moment. The politics are changing very, very quickly, but we're not nearly far enough along to avoid, I think, that 2 degrees of warming. We need absolutely radical, dramatic measures enacted immediately. And if we don't, we're going to be heading for climate scenarios well north of 2 degrees that are so punishing that many of us in the room would consider them unconscionable or immoral. They are those things. And yet it's also probably the case that we will find ourselves living in those scenarios, adapting to them in some ways. And that's the kind of great tragedy of this big story. But it's also important to keep in mind, I think, that, you hear about 2 degrees or you hear about these really hellish levels. Climate change is not something that, it's not a binary system. And the difference between staying below the threshold of catastrophe by 0.1 degrees and breaching it by 0.1 degrees, that's dramatic, but so is the difference between 2.5 degrees and 2.6 degrees. So is the difference between 2.9 degrees and 3.4 degrees. Every tick upward of temperature that we can avoid will allow us to avert some amount of suffering, and every tick upward that we produce will generate more suffering. And so, while in a certain way, I think we're already too late to avoid some dramatic impacts. In fact, there was a study last week showing that countries in the developing world have already lost as much as 35% of their potential GDP over recent decades because of the impacts of climate change. It will also never be too late to take action and to help the people of the future live more fulfilling, more just, more prosperous lives. And I think we're at a moment now where we're finally coming to terms with the speed, the scope, and the severity of the challenge, but we shouldn't let the scale of that horror show push us into despair or paralysis, because no matter how hot it gets, it will still be up to us to avoid future warming and help future generations live somewhat better.
So in the opening of your book, you are quite explicit that you don't consider yourself an environmentalist or a nature person. I also don't think that you would really slot into what we usually think of as environmental writers. So I'm curious what compelled you to write about an issue like climate change?
Yeah, it's sort of strange being up here as the author of a book on this subject and speaking to someone like you who's devoted so much of their life to this story when I'm such a latecomer to it. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I, walk down those concrete streets and look up at those steel buildings, and my emotional intuition is to think that I'm living outside of nature, that I'm protected by its forces. I think many of us, even living in in places that are more engaged with nature, still think in certain ways that the modern world is a defense against these forces, or even that we've conquered or defeated the forces of nature through modernity. And the more that I learned as a journalist, reading and thinking about the near future, digging into climate research, the more I understood just how totally naive and deluded that idea was. That, of course, we all live within nature. Everything we do is predicated on its premises. In fact, we are now living outside the boundary of temperature that has enclosed all of human history, which means that everything we know of as modern civilization, as human life, as social life, as political life, developed under climate conditions that no longer prevail. And that means to me that it's an open question which of them will endure in our new climate conditions, which are going to continue changing, so much so that it might be better to think of our near-term future even as we've landed collectively on a different planet with a different climate system, and we'll need to adapt. And when I started thinking in those terms, reading this research, it just seemed like a much more dramatic, all-encompassing, in the book I say even kind of mythological or theological story. Those terms make me uncomfortable in a certain way, but the truth is, if we brought the planet from a relatively stable situation 30 years ago, when I was 6 years old, to the brink of catastrophe where we are now, in just those 30 years, we now have about that much time to take action to avoid some of these worst-case outcomes. And that means that story, too, will be enclosed in my own lifetime, and yours, and in many of the lifetimes of people in this room. And I just felt, when I looked at in a kind of mercenary journalistic way, I'm a magazine editor, I looked at the magazines that I thought of as competitors, the newspapers I thought of as competitors. I just thought nobody was telling this story in that dramatic, epic way. And my own impulse as an editor is just to say, if I see a story differently than it's being told, maybe there'll be people out there who feel the same way, and maybe we should try to tell it that way and see what the response is. And so I wrote a story in 2017 that was explicitly focused on worst-case scenarios. The book is more focused on what we're likely to see this century. This original article was sort of on the scarier end of the spectrum, a bit as a sort of a trial balloon for my own feeling about this story, which is that it had not yet been told at the scale and with the kind of grab you by the collar energy and urgency that I felt it demanded. And there are people out there, Bill McKibben included, whose work I admire enormously. But I felt when I read the New York Times or read the Washington Post, I was not getting the same level of drama that I felt I needed to awaken me from my complacency on the issue. And when we published that story, it was an enormous phenomenon. It was for a long time the most widely read article that New York Magazine had ever published, which was a huge surprise. I mean, on some level, I felt like it was going to be a hit as I was writing it. But at the same time, I imbibed these lessons in my life as an editor that climate stories were traffic suicide, traffic kryptonite, that they were too earnest, people turned away from them, that sometimes you'd want to publish them out of a public service interest, but that there wasn't an audience for them in the way that we are a business, we're trying to get readers. And I really think, the success of my article and later the book is just they're just two of many, many data points suggesting, as you mentioned earlier, that we're really in a different moment now, that a lot of our intuitions and understanding of what the public wants and is ready for when it comes to climate are really relics from another era. And we're seeing much more engagement. We're seeing much more intense engagement. We're seeing protest movements of an unprecedented scale and intensity, as you say, not just in the US, but in Europe. The Parliament in England just declared a climate emergency. I mean, this is, we're debating the Green New Deal, which is a categorically more ambitious set of proposals than has ever been considered politically feasible in the US ever before. And, that's unbelievably thrilling, and yet, even so, the progress probably isn't fast enough. If we take seriously the timeline that the UN laid out, the fact that, all those millions more people are alarmed about climate change, the fact that 15% more people think that climate change is real than felt that way just 3 years ago, that's incredible movement by any political science standard. And yet, by the standard of science, it's still probably not moving fast enough. And I think one lesson from my work is that the more we tell this story honestly and with open eyes, the more that we're serious and, trust the public to understand the science, the more they will respond. I think that's one of the real lessons of the last couple of years. And I think we can all learn it going forward as we, try to engage more people on this issue and generate more progress.
Yeah, so you start your book with, a simple but powerful declarative sentence. It is worse, much worse than you think. And in some ways, I think part of what your book is intervening into is sort of actually, I think, a communications deficit in some ways that climate change has faced. It's far too often associated with, degrees and, sterile statistics about sea level rise, sort of these numbers that are really hard for us really to wrap our heads around unless we are experts and scientists, and, clearly also hard to wrap our heads around if we are policy people as well, because there are almost no policies in this area. So I think that in some ways what I saw you doing was actually sort of on the meta level a communications intervention. And so I was wondering what you think about that, and whether you think that this book sort of signals that it's okay now. There was always for a long time a concern that we would be too alarmist if we sort of spoke the way that you do. But I'm wondering if you think that debate should be settled.
Well, in general, I think that the story's too big to tell in any one way. It's too big to attack in any one way. But I did feel, when I first started writing about the subject, that there wasn't enough alarm in the writing, in the conversation about it. And I felt that way in part because it was fear that had brought me to the subject. I suspected there were many people like me who were, again, aware, even somewhat engaged, but functionally complacent about the issue. And while I also understood that they were people who had devoted their lives to it, spent decades working on the subject, and were themselves on the brink of despair or fatalism because they had seen so little progress, I also looked around the world and I just saw so many more people who were too complacent than I saw people who were at the risk of being fatalistic or despairing. And I thought, even if it was the case that a slightly more alarmist message would turn off some people who were already quite overwhelmed, that the value in agitating the public and making those who were casually engaged and casually concerned much, much more so was really valuable. And when I looked back at the history of environmental activism, I saw many reasons to believe that. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was called hyperbolic and alarmist when it was published, led to the ban on DDT, basically led to the creation of the EPA, and many more movements outside of the environmental movement, the movement against nuclear proliferation, the campaign against cigarette smoking, against drunk driving. These were all public campaigns that used fear effectively. And, the UN's analogy that we need to basically have a World War II against climate, that was not a war that we managed to fight entirely out of hope and optimism. But I also wouldn't want to leave hope and optimism entirely out of the equation. I think that different people relate to the subject in different ways at different times. There are, I'm basically known now as a climate alarmist, but there are certainly times when I'm hopeful and optimistic. There are times when I have a kind of geeky, even naive, technocratic perspective on it, that we can get this done. There are times that I relate to it at a kind of poetic level, just the incredible tragedy of the story, and even pulled in some more cosmic directions about it, thinking about what it tells us about our place in the universe. And I don't think we should go into the communications project thinking that there's only one way to tell the story, even to any individual, but certainly when we were talking about a population, a global population, many billions of people, that we should assume that there's only one way to communicate. And especially if that communication strategy involves some editing of what we know from the science, which is truly alarming, I think that's really dangerous. And I do think that the political movement that we've seen over the last year or so really illuminates, it's more than illuminates, it basically proves the value of some of this messaging. That UN report from last October did not contain any new science. What was new about it was that the scientific community felt compelled to speak in urgent, alarming terms about what was needed, what needed to be done, and how scary the world would look like if we didn't take action. And in just the 6 months after that, that's when we saw Sunrise blow up. That's when we saw Greta Thunberg starting her climate strikes. That's when we saw Extinction Rebellion take off in the UK. It's not a coincidence that all of these groups, which are focused almost, as a kind of first priority about telling the truth about the climate crisis, that they've generated so much response in this moment. Those things are extremely connected. The more that we're open with people about just what we're facing, the more people will be mobilized to take action. So I think, again, I wouldn't want to say everybody should be a climate alarmist. The only way to tell the story is alarmism. I don't. But I do think that it is incredibly valuable, and the recent history, just the last 6-9 months, show us just how much progress can be made if we do tell the truth.
No, absolutely. I think that truth is absolutely the only ground upon which justice or action should and can stand. I was really struck by the fact that in the book, and then in a number of the interviews that I've listened to, you describe yourself as still having hope. And honestly, after even working on the issue, and someone who's, I guess, professionally at least supposed to maintain some degree of hope, it was hard to finish reading some of those chapters about human bodies overheating due to humidity and just overwhelming heat waves. The revival of plagues that we haven't dealt with in hundreds of years, some of which our species has never encountered, and to feel any sort of sense of hope. And so I'm curious, as the person who's probably spent the most time with all of this material and thoughtfully put it into a narrative and something that will keep many of us up at night, how do you maintain that sort of hope as a writer, author, a person?
Well, I would say basically two big things. The first is that as horrible as the world 50 years from now or 70 years from now might look like, those horrors are a reflection of our power over the climate. What happens from here on out is up to us. The main driver of climate change is how much carbon we put into the atmosphere, and we can collectively determine exactly that. Now, who we is in that sentence is a complicated question, and there are many different communities that are affected in different ways, and many different interest groups that are focused on other things other than preserving the climate of the future. Let's say our politicians have different motivations than our activists, and it's the getting all of those people together is a complicated, urgent problem. Maybe more than, maybe the most important problem in dealing with this crisis. But when you pull back and think, this is not a system beyond our control, this is a system in our control. And ultimately, if we get to 2.8 degrees by the end of the century, or 3.5 degrees, or 4.2 degrees, it will be because of what we do and the choices we make from here on out. So that's one big part of the question. The other is what do we mean by hope? And, you know, I think most people casually engaged on climate have a baseline of expectation formed by their experience of the contemporary world, the contemporary climate. So we look out our windows, we know that they're suffering already in parts of the global south because of climate change, but we also think this is basically livable. You know, the world that we live in now, okay, we have some more wildfires than we did a few years ago, we have a few more hurricanes, we have some more heat waves, but it's not like this is yet pushing civilization to the brink of collapse. We could manage, and that's basically true. There's a lot of suffering already from climate change, but you know, globally speaking, we're not yet at a real point of collapse or disarray. But there's no way that the climate of today will be preserved. Even if we literally stopped putting carbon into the atmosphere today, we'd get at least a couple more tenths of a degree of warming, probably something more like about a half degree of warming just from the carbon that's in the air already and how that works its way through the climate system. So we're dealing with an absolute minimum of about 1.5 degrees of warming, and given how slow our politics is to move and how complicated some of the major infrastructure projects we need to build in order to really get to zero carbon quickly, probably something more like 2 degrees is our absolute best case scenario. But even that, I think, is not quite a fair baseline for expectation. Just speaking from a totally rational, even kind of sociopathically rational perspective, I think it's, you know, the only reasonable baseline is the track we're on now. The track we're on now is going to take us to about 4.3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That would mean $600 trillion in global climate damages, which is twice as much wealth as exists in the world today. It would mean there'd be parts of the planet that would be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. It would mean probably, at the very least, hundreds of millions of climate refugees, because even at 2 degrees, many of the biggest cities in South Asia and the Middle East will be unlivably hot in summer. So you won't be able to go outside. You certainly wouldn't be able to work outside without suffering a risk of heat stroke or possibly death. These are cities that have 10, 12, 15 million people living in them today. So if you base your expectation on like the quite temperate, whatever it is, 65-degree day in Berkeley that we're having today, you know, there's no cause for hope. There's no way that we're going to preserve that climate. But if you base your expectations off of the path we're on at 4.3 degrees, I think all of the political movement we're seeing is quite exciting because we're going to engineer change that is going to allow us to avert quite a lot of that suffering. How much, again, is still up to us. I tend to be uncomfortable making particular predictions, but if we're on track for 4.3 degrees, I don't think it's at all unreasonable to think that even without a kind of revolutionary transformation of our politics and culture, we could stay below 3 degrees by the end of the century, and probably better than that if we do achieve something more dramatic and a change to our politics. So if you think about it in those terms, then we have there's quite a lot of work to do and quite a lot that we can do to avert future suffering and make the future more livable for us and our children and grandchildren. But I think all of us have these sort of biases, emotional reflexes that anchor our expectations in the today, and that makes any additional warming seem terrifying. And if that's your perspective, I think, you know, we're in for a dark couple of decades. But on that point, you know, the most important thing we can do to make us feel better about the future is to take action and make progress. And if we're worried about the psychological impacts of projections, which some people are, think the science is so scary, we should think twice about how we talk about it with people. To me, that's just more of an argument for taking action and taking action faster. Because if we don't, we're not just going to be talking about those scenarios as possibilities, we're going to be living in them. And I think that even in a more immediate way, if projections, predictions, pictures of the near climate future scare you as they scare me, the most important, empowering thing to do is to engage and not feel helpless, not feel hopeless, but do what you can to help make a change. I've been able to do that a little bit as a writer, but there are many more people like Julian who are engaged in it in an even more direct way. And those avenues are open to all of us, even if it's just at the level of voting for candidates who support and prioritize climate, and then holding them to account when they're up for re-election. That's a kind of bare minimum commitment. But there are many more commitments that each of us can make every day. And I think that that is the only, it's the only responsible, but it's also the healthiest response to everything we know about the science, which says if we don't move fast, the world is going to get quite punishing quite quickly.
Here in Berkeley, we may be accused of preaching to the choir. As a resident of Oakland, I think I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah.
But so I also just, there was actually one point in which citizens of Berkeley, I think, might reasonably be maybe not perhaps as afraid as our brothers and sisters in the Global South, but you do talk about a storm, ARC storm, I believe, that the U.S. Geological Survey modeled, in which there's just massive winter storms and flooding in the Central Valley that run through the Bay Area and Berkeley and cause immense damages, much bigger than the sort of big earthquake that we're all preparing for. So I think that's around page 1 something. 115 or whatever. Yeah, so the point is that here in Berkeley, yes, we will vote in the right ways, I believe. We do have some things to be concerned about in terms of climate disasters and impacts, but we will not, the impacts will be felt here as well. And some of those impacts, and I think this is actually sort of my favorite part of the book is divided into 4 parts. There's an introduction and conclusion portion. The introduction you call cascades, and the conclusion you call the anthropic principle. The second part, in which I think we've spent maybe most of our time discussing elements of that today, is called the
Elements of Chaos.
Elements of Chaos, thank you, yes. But my favorite was actually the part 3, in which, the climate kaleidoscope, yes, in which you sort of discuss and explore the impacts that the climate crisis is going to have on sort of the fundamental tenets of what I would describe as sort of the humanities, philosophy, the social sciences. And so I was wondering if you can take this kind of direction in whatever you want, but if you wanted to discuss the ways in which climate change, you see it sort of impacting those big sort of meta issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is the part of the book that I was most interested in myself. I come to the subject not even as a science journalist. So while the science of climate change offers, it's just an unbelievable and, like I say, kind of cinematic science, in certain ways easy to write dramatically, it also was not the set of questions that I was most myself interested in or focused on. And those were really if we start living in a world that is impacted in all the ways that the science projects, what that will mean for our politics and our geopolitics, our culture, our pop culture, our storytelling, our technology, our relationship to technology, our relationship to economics. And I think ultimately that those impacts may be as profound or more profound than the ones that are coming directly from the climate. And I do think that, we're an adaptable species. Even if things get quite terrible, we will endure. Our civilization will endure in some form. The question is, in what form? And so I was trying to think through some of these areas, not offer sort of particular clear predictions in the sense that who knows what will happen, but sketching out some of the landscape of possibilities in each of those areas. And I do think that this century that we're entering into is and will be defined by climate change as the central story of its time, in much the way that the 19th century was defined by modernity, or the late 20th by financial capitalism. Climate change will be everywhere. And by that I mean, our politics. Let's take a few examples. Our politics. If you were to imagine what politics would evolve in a time of somewhat fast climate change, you would imagine sort of intuitions of increasing resource scarcity, which could produce more sense of competition between nations and between groups within nations. You would imagine, therefore, a kind of more nationalistic, nativistic politics, more self-interest. And obviously, as we look around the world, we're already seeing our politics move in that way, or at least has moved that way over the last few years. There are countervailing movements as well, but generally speaking, while I'm not comfortable saying that, say, Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, are projections of climate politics, I think we should not be surprised to see more people like them take the stage over the next few decades. Globally, I think, the Paris Climate Accords, which we signed just a few years ago, are already a failure, at least at this current stage. No major industrial nation is on track to honor its commitments under Paris. And I think in certain ways that means that the liberal international order that gave rise to that agreement may not be workable as a model for true international collaboration and cooperation going forward. I don't know exactly what will replace it, but I do think that it's quite likely that in relatively short order we have a global system that is built centrally around questions of climate and carbon in much the way that the one that emerged after World War II was at least rhetorically oriented around questions of human rights, peace, and prosperity. Now we know that that order was also an alibi often for really bad behavior by nations, and I imagine that probably the same will be true of an international order that's oriented around climate change and carbon. But I do think that we'll start to see that be the central story of those international agreements, of those international rivalries. And in fact, I think we're starting to see that story emerge already. You hear about MBS, the kind of awful nominal leader, or maybe he's not nominal, like technically leader of Saudi Arabia, brutal in so many ways, saying that he needs his country's economy to be entirely off oil by 2050 and mostly off oil by 2030. I think that contains real wisdom about the changing shape of the world order. He does not believe that a country like his could continue producing oil as recklessly as Saudi Arabia has and still expect a seat at the community of nations as soon as 10 years from now. And I think that there will be sanctions put together on the basis of climate behavior and carbon behavior, and even conceivably wars fought in that name. If Jair Bolsonaro came to power 30 years from now, threatening to cut down the Amazon, I'm not sure I'd bet on like a Chinese army coming in and taking him out, but I don't think it's completely off the table, as pulled from science fiction as that may sound. Because if you had asked someone in the 1920s or 1930s in Europe whether they thought it was possible that wars would be fought in the name of human rights a few decades down the line, they would have laughed at you too. And a lot of those wars were bad wars. We shouldn't have fought them. But they were motivated by, or at least sold on the basis of human rights. I think we'll start to see great power rivalry conducted in the name of climate change going forward. And I think that these changes will reverberate, all the way down to the level of individuals. Already, you read a lot about the dilemma of having children, whether people, even in the well-off West, who are likely to be, to the extent that they can be protected from the impacts of climate change, the people who are most able to protect themselves, still worrying about these questions, worrying about these issues, and presumably those dilemmas will be felt even more intensely in parts of the world where the impacts come more intensely. Our storytelling, I think, will change such that, in the background of romantic comedies will be features of a changed landscape. In the background of our comedies will be, or even the foreground of our comedies will be the irony of our knowing the world is burning and doing nothing to stop it. I had a coffee recently with somebody who worked for a couple decades on The Daily Show who's trying to make a new program about comedy about climate change. And that may sound completely insane, but I think in 10 years we will have to be laughing about climate change as well as being horrified by it, because it will be the theater of all of our experience, and everything we will be doing will be conducted according to its terms. And in the book I write also about how it may change our relationship to technology. On some level, technology is to blame for this crisis. On another level, it could help us get out of it, through renewable energy, even through carbon capture. We may yet find kind of new deus ex machina solutions, and those may, in addition to climate change may turn us against technology, and it may make us worship technology. It may make us do both of those things at the same time. I also write about how it may be the case that already we're sort of, through our smartphone addiction, basically, learning to adapt to a world in which we're defining what is real as what we see on our screens rather than what we see in the real world. Because the real world is degraded enough that we don't want to look at it all that closely. And that may become even more the case in the decades ahead. I also write about economics and capitalism, and I think here the question is just as open-ended and could have many, many different outcomes. I think it's possible that we end up in a world in which climate change is run rampant and yet is used as an excuse by those who are empowered by capital to preserve their own interests and enforce their own view of the world. I think it's possible that we renovate the system, the economic system we live in, significantly to make sure that those who are hurting most suffer a little bit less. And I think that there are a huge variety of other possibilities that could emerge as well. But when you learn about just how dramatic the impacts on our economics could be, and how much of the entire history of economic growth, which is really perfectly coincident with the history of our burning of fossil fuels, may in fact be dependent on industrialization, and how that would change our whole view of history and what amounts to progress and how much progress we can count on going forward if we lose at least some significant amount of the possibility of economic growth, and possibly in large parts of the world, all of that possibility of economic growth. It does really change the way that you think of the future and the past, and our place in nature and our place in the long saga of human history. I'm a child of the 90s. I would have argued with you if you had told me as a teenager that, the US was a pure force for good, or markets were perfect and globalization was, divine. And yet, in some intuitive way, those ideas did form a basic perspective on the world, which was that things were going to get better over time, and that progress was erratic and required vigilance. But nevertheless, I could sort of reliably count on the fact that 50 years from now, life would be better, generally speaking, than it was today, in the same way that life is better now, generally speaking, than it was 50 years ago. And climate change is only one of the reasons why I'm considerably more skeptical of that today. But I think it's quite possible that 30 or 40 years ago, we've abandoned that model of history entirely and embraced something much more like the way that humans viewed the world before the Industrial Revolution, which was that they understood themselves as living in a kind of eternal state, where the life of their children was quite like their own and quite like the lives of their great-grandparents. Now, I don't know exactly how likely that is, but again, I think it's on the table. If we really continue the path that we're on and do as much damage to the world as we're scheduled to, and see as much, especially of the equatorial band of the world, literally lose the entire prospect of any economic growth at all, I do think that we're going to be living in a really different world, because as you know, as everyone in this room knows, we've oriented our culture so much around the promise of economic growth that when you withdraw it, it's hard to know exactly what will orient it instead.
I mean, there's a lot to work with there, and I highly recommend people pick up the book. And in particular, I do think that what you're getting at in part 3 is quite profound stuff. I wanted to sort of turn back though to the more personal, the sort of questions about how we as communities, as individuals, as humans, respond to this new climate reality, this new environmental reality that we're living in, this new economic reality, all the realities that we're going to be facing. In the book, you obviously get to interview and sort of prod at some of the more unusual responses to this. You write about folks who have turned to stoicism, nihilism, sort of all sorts of different responses. Of course, we also know that the fossil fuel corporations, their response to climate change, Exxon knew about climate change at least as early as the 1950s. They started raising the height of the drilling rigs to respond to sea level rise. And at the same time, they also took out many advertorials in papers that maybe some of you subscribe to, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, to sort of muddy the waters of climate science. That was one response to climate change. But also, I think, and you've spoken about this a little bit, we also see young people sitting in the Speaker of the House's office. I saw at Pine Ridge people building homes amidst flooding. So there are many, many human responses to climate change, over 6 billion, I guess, really. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, what you personally see as the appropriate sort of way to protect your spirit, to maintain sort of your humanness, your compassion in the face of this overwhelming challenge.
Well, I'm not sure that I know a good strategy, but I do think that the most important thing to try to preserve is empathy. I write in the book a little bit about this study just about air pollution, which says that the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming, just through the impact of air pollution, which is not exactly a climate impact, but is produced by the same thing that produces climate change, which is the burning of fossil fuels. Just that half degree of warming, just through air pollution, the study's authors say would kill an additional 153 million people. And that's death equivalent to 25 Holocausts. And when I say that, when I tell people that casually, when I tell people that in interviews, when I say it in an audience, in front of an audience like this, I see eyes open and faces go ashen. And people think, how could we possibly conscience that amount of suffering and pain and death? Which is the right response. We shouldn't. But 9 million people are already dying every year from air pollution. That's a Holocaust, technically a Holocaust and a half, every year. And we are not thinking about those people nearly as much as we should. That's true of those of us in the privileged, wealthy West, but it's also true of many people elsewhere in the world. We just aren't as open to and focused on the suffering of others as we need to be. And in the face of climate change, it worries me tremendously that the one prevalent response would be towards a more intense focus on self-interest and a less developed sense of empathy. This is, I think, actually, if I were to make a prediction of all the emotional responses that we could have as a species to this crisis, from stoicism to with total withdrawal from society to really engaged activism, honestly, I think that the most likely outcome is that we normalize more and more suffering as we go forward and create pain, intense pain, lots of dying, lots of strife, and yet find a way to live our lives thinking that they're basically normal and that we're not living in an unprecedented time with unprecedented challenges and unprecedented suffering, but that we're just doing our thing. That is the thing that worries me the most. It's, when I think about, I just had a child a year ago, and I think about her life, it's the thing that I want to most impart to her is an unshakable sense of empathy that extends to everyone on the planet. I don't personally know how to make sure, even in myself, that those impulses endure, because I think like anyone else, I have contrary impulses too. I mean, I think we shouldn't be scared to admit that about ourselves, that in addition to having our political ambitions and wanting to see the world change in ways that we think will be more humane and kind, we also like to see friends and watch basketball, and we're not completely overwhelmed by this story either. But to the extent that we can preserve and cultivate the impulse of empathy and extend it, I think that's the most important thing to do. And it will, govern and dictate all the other actions that we can take, because if we're truly worried about, the plight of those living in, say, India and Bangladesh, Sub-Saharan Africa, as much as we're worried about the person we know in, who has a house in Santa Rosa, then we're going to take much more dramatic action than if all we care about is not just Americans, but the Americans close to us. And I hope we can sort of find a way towards that different kind of empathic politics. But, there are also reasons for doubt.
I have to admit that my empathic politics are deeply impacted by the last outcome of the Golden State Warriors game, usually. So today, less empathic than Friday.
Well, Houston's an oil city, so.
It's because Houston's an oil city. Houston's an oil city. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes-ish left. I am a believer in democratic processes. I don't think that I probably asked all the best questions. I think that many of you will have fantastic questions. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to members of the audience. And I think that we have a wireless microphone. Yes?
If we have a lot of people, it might be better if you queue up, because it's going to hard to keep it. I saw you first.
We'll start back here. That's my auntie.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Being that we have a native interviewer and I haven't read the book, I'm curious if you address anything about traditional knowledge of indigenous people as a solution.
I'm probably not as much as I should. I mean, I mentioned stuff along those lines in a couple places, but not at length, is the honest answer. But I do think that there is great wisdom outside of the consumptive impulses of the West in the world already, and that we can learn from those communities, to our benefit, for sure.
So about a decade ago or whenever, Elizabeth Colbert wrote Field Notes from a Catastrophe. And in it, she had a chart, the implications of which have haunted me ever since, but I don't see them discussed, and you didn't mention it today. So I'm curious whether you have encountered this particular terror. She showed a chart of ocean temperatures as registered in the ice up in Greenland, going back about 400,000 years. And it's basically like this, which means that you can't have agriculture because you don't know what to plant. Even if you've got climate control, you don't know. You're planning for cold, you're planning for hot. It was swinging wildly, and then of course climate swings much more wildly than the ocean does. And then about 12,000 years ago, it suddenly gets like this, levels out. And then so we got human civilization, because agriculture came along, so then you could get institutions, because things became predictable. I mean, the little ice age is just a tiny thing compared to the swings we were having before. My brother-in-law works in climate change, he's a physicist, and I asked him a few years ago, what led to that stabilization and how we make sure we don't mess with that, seeing as how we now have carbon at a level that was before humans, back when crocodiles were at the North Pole. And he said, we don't yet have the physics to understand why climate stabilized 12,000 years ago. So when I think about potential impacts from rising carbon, I think even if we learned how to suck it all out of the air, which is, our childhood fantasy of how they're going to deal with it, if we don't drastically improve, we may yet trip whatever caused that stabilization, at which point we don't have tools because we weren't responsible for creating the stability. I'm just wondering if anybody, that figures in the book, if you heard about this as you were researching.
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the system you're describing, but to the extent, the sort of broad strokes of it, it's not just that climate has been stable for 12,000 years. Climate has been stable for all of human history. I mean, it may be considerably more stable over the last 10 or 12,000 years, but the temperature boundaries that have governed all of human history, which is hundreds of millions of the last couple million years, those conditions have been quite stable. And we're now already outside of those conditions. Considerably more dramatic swings are possible because of, in addition to how much carbon we put into the atmosphere, what are called these climate feedback loops, which can accelerate warming. Some of them work in the opposite direction, but more of them seem poised to accelerate warming. And that's one reason why scientists are quite worried about carbon getting really any more intensely concentrated than it is, because it's not just that at 450 parts per million, X, Y, and Z will happen. It's also that at 450 parts per million, there are impacts that we haven't really begun to think about, which could unfold. There was a paper a few months ago that was especially startling to me, which said that at about, I think it was at about 1,200 parts per million, which is considerably higher than we are today, but we could hit early next century. If we hit 1,200 parts per million, we would completely eliminate the Earth's ability to form cloud cover. And that alone would add 8 degrees Celsius of warming to the planet's temperature, which means that we'd probably be at about 5.5 degrees at that point, and that we could immediately, within a decade, get up to 12, 13, 14 degrees. And that would really be a point at which not just human civilization, but possibly human life would become quite difficult to sustain, certainly at the numbers that we have it today. So that's the most intense climate feedback that I've read about, but there are many more that have somewhat smaller impacts that would nevertheless push us from what is a workable situation to a considerably less workable situation. And in general, the closer we keep carbon to where it is now, in fact, we need to lower carbon from where it is now. The closer we keep the temperature to where it is now, the less likely we'll trigger some of these impacts. But as your brother-in-law, I don't remember, said, yeah, we don't entirely understand when those triggers are triggered. And so the best thing we can do is just avoid the risk.
Hello. Okay. I think one of the reasons it's hard for people to face this issue is the question of what do we do? What can we do as individuals that will be effective? So I want to ask you for some advice about what to do beyond voting for the right candidate, trying to cut down on my own carbon footprint, going to protests. And I've been reading a really good book by Paul Hawken called The 100 Best Solutions to Climate Change. And a lot of them require rapid technological development. He says the biggest contributor to warming is actually refrigerants, the chemicals used in refrigerants. Does that sound right to you? So air conditioning and refrigerators. I want to ask you that first, and then I want to ask you, and those chemicals are actually being phased out. There was an agreement to phase them out, but the way they're dispensed of is very, very important, because apparently they can warm the climate 1,000 to 9,000 times faster than other CO2 emissions. So I'm wondering, for something like that, how do individual consumers and citizens put, say, pressure to get, to deal with refrigerants? He said just dealing with that one thing could spare the world 1 whole degree of warming.
I think I'm an admirer of Paul Hawkins and that book. I think everything that he lists there is essentially a political project. I don't think that it can be achieved at an individual level. And I think that that's basically true, as uncomfortable as it makes us feel about everything when it comes to climate change. People who want to reduce their own carbon footprints should do so. That's noble of them. It's, I think, especially useful in the sense that it advertises to those around them and to their leaders that you can continue to live a kind of prosperous, fulfilling life and still be responsible, and so invites more climate action. But when you realize that we don't just need to reduce carbon emissions, we need to eliminate them entirely, that's just not a project that can be achieved through individual action. If everyone in this room never got on an airplane again, if everyone we knew never got on an airplane again, if everyone in the entire United States never got on an airplane again, there would still be hundreds of millions, if not billions of people elsewhere in the world who are eager to fly. And that means that what we need is a new form of air travel that produces no carbon, either electric planes or zero carbon fuels. Those are technological innovations that would require massive R&D, so massive I think they would have to be public, and also real aggressive legislation and regulation that would require airplane manufacturers to be making planes that way and airlines to fly those planes. And I think that's basically true in every sector, that simply even large-scale collective action built on individual choices is insufficient to the problem. If we really need to zero out carbon globally by 2050, which is what the UN says we need to do, we need policy action. And so, you started by asking what beyond politics I can do. My answer is that politics is by far the most important thing, and that we need to reshape our political priorities at the level of communities, at the level of states, at the level of our nation, and globally, so that we are investing in and developing those technologies, but also imposing quite serious regulations and limitations on carbon production in order to have a hope of avoiding, this level of catastrophic warming.
So at the very beginning of this talk, you mentioned a number of nonfiction books that deal with climate change, and I just wanted to throw out there a couple of fiction books like Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140, Paolo Bacigalupi's The Water Knife, Rebecca Roanhorse's Trail of Lightning, just so people, these books also take a fictional view of what life could be like after climate change is, kind of post-apocalyptic. My question is, there's another book that's fiction that I'm in the middle of, Richard Powers' The Overstory, which is kind of about trees, and is I think raises the point of humans being another aspect of our biologic system. And I'm wondering, in hearing the talk today, I hear about technological possible solutions and what climate change could mean for human culture. But does your book also go into what it takes to, what the biological world will look like and what humans' part will be in that biological world as the temperature rises? And I didn't get a clear picture of that. Should I pick up the book and it's in there? Yeah. My other question is, do you guys have candidates? Because I'm really torn for 2020. So those two questions. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I deal with some of those questions in the book. I'm not sure exactly, in some ways at some length. And I think that the way that we farm, the way that we relate to plant life on the planet is really important as a part of this story. Plants suck carbon out of the atmosphere and they produce oxygen. So the more that we have of them and the more that we cultivate them to emphasize that function, the better off we'll be. And yeah, I talk also about the way that humans will be biologically affected by climate change. Some of that's actually the stuff that's scariest to me. There's a story I tell in the book about these species of antelope, the Saiga antelope, which live in Siberia, and they were basically wiped out entirely one summer, I think it was in 2015, because especially humid conditions and hot conditions that summer changed the activity of the bacteria in their guts and turned them from, these bacteria had lived inside the antelope for millions of years, and it turned them into, sort of enemies of the antelope, and the way that they killed them all. It's like setting off a biological time bomb in them. We all know from research over the last few years that humans are also complicated creatures with many millions of bacteria and viruses within us. And while I don't think it's the case that most of those bacteria and viruses will change dramatically based on 2 or 3 degrees of warming, I think it's a fair bet that some of them will, and in fact affect the way that our bodies function to some degree. And when you realize that the bacteria in our guts, they don't just help us digest, they regulate our moods, they have a relationship to mental illness and autism and you see that, climate change could have a really quite dramatic impact on our individual biological lives as well. And that to me is sort of underexplored territory, but it's among the most scary possibilities that I write about in the book. As for candidates, I'm really excited to see a primary where there's like an arms race of seriousness about this issue. That's actually the thing that I'm most excited about. I think to this point, I think you'd have to say that Jay Inslee is the person who's most serious about climate change in the field. And, but I also, I'm personally like a lot of the other candidates as well. I was excited to see Beto, who comes from a kind of fossil money background, still coming out with his first policy proposal be focused on climate, and to respond to the climate movement by giving back money that he had taken from fossil fuel executives. That was kind of an exciting gesture too. I don't think that he's likely to be like the best on climate in the field, but still great to see him taking the issue so seriously. And I'm excited to see the other candidates roll out their policies over the next few months. But overall, I'm curious to know what Julian says, but overall, I just think how great that, climate change is, according to one poll, the top issue for Democrats in 2020. Certainly one of the top couple issues, and will actually dominate a primary season just one election cycle after no question was asked at the presidential debates at all about climate change. This is, as I said earlier, this is unbelievably rapid change that we're living through. And, there are issues I have, I'm sure Julian does too, with particular candidates, particular proposals, but in general, just the speed of that movement is, to me, exhilarating.
Yeah, I'll go real quick. I think momentum is definitely our candidate. Jay Inslee does cite our Data for Progress blueprint for a Green New Deal in his most recent climate platform offering, which was very cool. At the same time, I'd also plug 350 Action has a climate scorecard for all 20 or whatever number of candidates we're at now, way too many. And it scores their standing on three core issues to the movement. Firstly, their commitment to the Green New Deal. Secondly, their commitment to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And thirdly, whether or not they have signed the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, so whether they're going to defend democracy against fossil fuel corporations. You can check that out at 350action.org. It's our 2020 climate scorecard. We keep it up to date with the news cycle. I helped build it. I'm really proud of it. So yeah, you can check that out. And there's other things that activists are going to be doing around like first day pledges, that kind of stuff as well.
Good morning, my name is Alex, and first I just wanted to express gratitude. Your work is one of the reasons I left my job at the end of December to start a company to focus 100% on this. And I know it comes at a cost too, being this open about the views you're talking about. This question I kind of wanted to pose to both of you. You were mentioning about, the stories that we tell. And it's one thing when you come to Berkeley, you're gonna have a room this full at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning, but what have been your techniques and strategies for communicating to community, like low-income communities and communities of color who they're just struggling to survive day to day, and then to bring on what's going to happen in the next 3, 12, 50, 100 years? How have you tried to connect with those audiences? What have your strategies been?
Well, I'm actually more curious to hear what Julian has to say, since I have less experience in the kind of outreach advocacy sphere. But personally, my own impulses are basically the same as with any audience, which is just tell the truth, be honest about what's happening, and do whatever I can to, explain the sort of the context of the story as I see it and what opportunities are available to those communities. But Julian, what do you have to say?
I think that we need to believe in the power of two things. Firstly, the power of the internet to reach people. I think that the scale at which we are able to communicate and organize and the communities that we can reach through the internet is enormous now. One statistic that I like to bring up and tell to people who have the ability to direct money and where it goes in this sort of organizing world is that Latinx communities, for example, actually consistently show on survey data that they are more concerned about climate change than their peers, their non-Latinx peers. And so, for example, I think that organizations like LCV, but many others, should be putting resources into organizing the Latino community on this issue. I think that, for example, if you plop down a couple organizers in North Las Vegas, Nevada is a Super Tuesday, is an early primary state. I think that the impact there of getting those communities organized on an issue that they already apparently care a lot about could have a lot of impact. And secondly, it's that other piece, which is organizing. I think that you need to believe in the ability of people to go into communities, or if they're from that community, to come within their community and get people organized on an issue. I think that the Sunrise Movement has shown this in a very persuasive way. The school strikes have shown this in a very persuasive way. And I think that, at the end of the day, you have to root that in a sort of a moral message, right? The reason in which we all should care about this is not because of ultimately the science, or ultimately because of, we care more about 2 degrees of warming rather than 3, but because this is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for our people now. It's the right thing to do for the people who come behind us tomorrow. And I think if we stick to that message, I think that it can be quite moving, especially as we have momentum behind us right now. And I think that is going to be it. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out today here at the Berkeley. Yes. And can we give a round of applause to David?
And to Julian. Thanks, everybody.